Hello.
My stepsons told me to shut up and remember I'm nobody in their house. So I removed myself from this family, along with the money, payments, and privileges. They realized it too late. Don't forget to subscribe and share your experiences below. Let's get started. My name is Dan, and I am 52 years old. For more than 15 years I've lived with Margaret, though we never married. Some people might say that was a mistake, that without the paper and the vows, there is no true anchor. But back then it felt right. We built something together. A home, a life, a rhythm of mornings and evenings where I thought love and sacrifice were enough to keep the foundation steady. I put my money, my sweat, and my years into that house and into her family. And when I say her family, I mean her two boys, Chris and Evan. When I first met them, they were still young enough to believe in heroes but already old enough to resent anyone who tried to step into the space their father had abandoned. Paul, their biological father, was nothing more than a faint echo in their lives. He wasn't dead, though he might as well have been. He would reappear just long enough to prove he hadn't disappeared completely. A late phone call on a birthday, a Christmas card that arrived sometime in January, sometimes a promise to visit that always dissolved into excuses about work, about travel, about bad timing. He was a ghost who carried their blood but never their weight. I was the one who stayed. I drove them to school in the freezing mornings, my hands stiff on the steering wheel while they sat in the back seat arguing about music. I picked them up from practice and sat in the bleachers in the rain, clapping even when no one else did. I patched their tires, fixed their bikes, kept their phones connected, filled their gas tanks, and signed checks for things they never even knew cost money. I paid for school trips when other parents turned them down. I bought Evan his first laptop for college. I covered every insurance bill, every emergency expense, every extracurricular program that made them look good in front of their peers. When Evan's acceptance letter arrived, Margaret cried tears of joy. She hugged him, she kissed him, and then she looked at me. Not with thanks, not with acknowledgement, but with expectation. Because it was understood, silently but absolutely, that I would pay for it all. And I did. I paid the tuition in full, the housing, the books, the endless costs that drained the marrow from my bones. The debt wasn't his. It was mine. But what was I in their eyes? Not Dad. Not even close. I was Mom's guy. A man who lived in the house and paid the bills. A faceless sponsor who existed only to provide. I remember thinking, foolishly, naively, that one day all this sacrifice would turn into respect. That after years of showing up, of staying when their real father drifted, they would look at me and see a man who had been there for them in every way that mattered. I imagined a moment where one of them would say, "Thanks, Dan. You've been like a father to us." But that day never came. Not once. Not in 15 years. Instead, what came were demands. I need new sneakers. Cover my car insurance. Can you pay my phone bill? I'm short on rent this month. They didn't ask, they demanded, with the casual tone of boys who believed it was their right to take without giving. Gratitude never crossed their lips. Respect never touched their eyes. All I ever heard was the sound of entitlement, the sharp click of their voices when they reminded me, directly or indirectly, that I wasn't their father. And yet I kept paying. I kept showing up. I kept believing that if I gave just a little more, worked just a little harder, offered one more act of generosity, they might one day soften. I thought that money could fill the space between us, that my labor could become love. I poured tens of thousands into their lives. Money I will never see again. Time I will never recover. My back ached from the hours I put in. My hands cracked from the work. But I told myself it was worth it because I was doing it for family. Family. That word used to mean something to me. We lived in a small Tennessee town where everyone knows each other, where the gossip runs faster than the river and reputations stick like tar. People saw me at football games, at parent-teacher nights, at fundraisers. They saw me standing next to Margaret, paying for raffle tickets, clapping for school plays. They thought I was their father. They nodded at me in the supermarket, called me a good man, told me the boys were lucky to have me. And every time I smiled, even though the boys themselves never once called me Dad, never even hinted at it. Behind closed doors, I was invisible. A bank account with a heartbeat. The truth is, I told myself lies. I told myself that respect takes time, that patience was the only currency that could buy it. I told myself that teenagers are cruel by nature, that one day they would grow out of it, look back, and see who had truly been there for them. I clung to that fantasy like a drowning man clings to driftwood. But driftwood cannot hold the weight of a man. And fantasies cannot hold the weight of a family that never saw me as part of it. Still, I played my role. I paid for trips they barely acknowledged me on. I filled their cars with gas so they could drive past me without a word. I bought them clothes they never thanked me for. I stayed up late fixing things they broke. I gave them everything I had, and when it wasn't enough, I found more to give. I worked overtime, I took side jobs. I poured every dollar and every ounce of energy into building a life where they never went without. And what did I get in return? Silence, indifference, mockery, sometimes little jabs about how I wasn't their dad, how I couldn't tell them what to do, how I was just the guy with mom. Margaret never corrected them. She never defended me. She stood in the kitchen with her arms crossed, her mouth closed, as if her silence excused everything. Years of this. Years of labor, years of sacrifice. And the cruelest part is this. I believed it was all worth it. I believed that money and effort, consistency and presence, could one day transform into recognition. That if I just kept pushing, one day Chris or Evan would see me, really see me, and give me what I wanted more than anything. Acknowledgement, respect, a word, a gesture, anything to prove I wasn't wasting my life on shadows. But respect never came. Only demands. Only the endless expectation that I would provide, no matter how they treated me. And so I became what they saw. Not a father, not a man, but a faceless benefactor. The one who paid. The one who stayed silent. The one who believed that family could be bought with sacrifice. I see now how foolish I was. Because family built on silence is no family at all. And the years I spent trying to buy love only left me poorer. Not just in money, but in dignity. It happened on a night that should have been ordinary, the kind of evening where families eat together and talk about the small details of their day. I had grilled steaks on the back porch, the smoke curling into the darkening Tennessee sky, while Margaret set the table. Chris was already scrolling on his phone, his fork tapping against the plate in impatience. Evan was home from college for the weekend, his clothes already strewn across the living room like he had never left at all. We sat down together, the four of us, and for a brief moment I almost convinced myself that this was what family looked like. The sound of forks against plates, the smell of roasted potatoes, the hum of conversation. It was fragile like glass, but I let myself believe in it. Then it shattered. It started with something so small I almost laugh at it now, except it wasn't funny then, and it never will be. Dinner was over, the plates half empty, crumbs scattered across the table. I looked at Chris, the younger one, and said in a calm voice, "Clear the table, will you?" He didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed on his phone. A long silence stretched across the room, the kind of silence that tells you everyone is waiting to see who will break first. Finally, he looked up at me. Not with the eyes of a boy, but with the cold arrogance of someone who thinks they've already won. "Shut up," he snapped. "Remember you're nobody in this house." The words struck like a slap. My breath caught, the steak turning to stone in my throat. For a moment I couldn't even speak. And then Evan, the one whose tuition I paid, the one whose future I had built with my bare hands, leaned back in his chair and smirked. "Yeah," he said, "you're not our dad. Don't even try to act like one." It's strange how a sentence can feel like a blade. It doesn't touch the skin, but it cuts something deeper, something you can't stitch back together. I sat there, staring at the two boys I had raised, listening to their laughter, their voices dripping with contempt. 15 years of sacrifice collapsed into nothing in the space of a single dinner. Margaret said nothing. She didn't slam her hand on the table, didn't scold them, didn't demand they show me the respect I had earned. She just sat there, her lips pressed tight, her eyes darting between us like she wanted the moment to pass without her having to take a side. Her silence was louder than their words. I wanted to speak. I wanted to roar, to remind them of every bill I had paid, every morning I had driven them to school, every broken thing I had fixed with my hands. I wanted to list every dollar, every sacrifice, every piece of myself I had carved away to keep them comfortable. But the words died in my throat, because what was the point? They had already spoken their truth. I sat quietly, my fork still in my hand, though I wasn't eating anymore. I stared at the wood grain of the table and felt something inside me crack, something that would never mend. That night I didn't sleep. I lay in bed beside Margaret, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the air conditioner. Her breathing was steady, peaceful, like nothing had happened at all. Meanwhile, their words echoed in my head. "You're nobody. You're not our dad." Over and over, the syllables cut deeper until I could hardly breathe. By morning, I had made my choice. If I was nobody, then nobody I would be. If I had no rights in their eyes, then I had no responsibilities either. I started small. The next day, I canceled their streaming subscriptions, the ones tied to my account. I shut off the Spotify family plan they used for free. By evening, Chris stormed into the living room asking why his shows weren't working. I shrugged. "Must be a problem with the account," I said calmly. Then I stopped paying for their gas. Chris's tank ran dry a week later. He cursed me under his breath as he borrowed money from Margaret. Evan called from campus, furious that his credit card had been declined when he tried to buy books. I told him to ask his father. Within days, I went further. I called the bank and shut down the credit card they used for emergencies. I pulled my share of money from the joint account Margaret liked to dip into whenever the boys needed something extra. I stopped covering the household bills, the internet, the phone plans, the insurance policies. The quiet machine of comfort they had grown used to was powered by me, and I switched it off. Chris exploded first. He screamed that I was a traitor, that I was petty, that I was ruining his life. Evan called me from campus, his voice sharp with anger, demanding to know what I thought I was doing. I listened to every word and then answered in the calmest voice I could manage. "I'm nobody, right? Then live without me." The shock in their voices told me they hadn't expected this. They thought the insults would be free, that my sacrifices would continue no matter how they spat in my face. They had grown so used to taking that the idea of being cut off felt like betrayal. But what about my betrayal? 15 years of devotion erased in a sentence. Did that not count? Margaret begged me not to go this far. She pleaded in the kitchen late at night, whispering so the boys wouldn't hear. "Don't punish them like this, Dan. They're young. They don't know what they're saying." But I knew better. Children speak the truth adults are too cowardly to say out loud. They had told me exactly how they saw me, and I believed them. The breaking point came just days later, when Evan's senior prom arrived. He had been talking about it for months, the limo, the tuxedo, the photographer, the dinner reservations. He wanted it to be perfect, a night to remember. And of course, all of it had been planned under the assumption that I would pay. But when the time came, there was no limo, no tuxedo, no professional photographs, no glamorous evening in some rented ballroom. Without my money, the dream collapsed into a cheap cafeteria party, the kind of night that looked nothing like the glossy fantasies he had imagined. His girlfriend wore a dress borrowed from a cousin, and he wore a suit that didn't quite fit. I watched his face when the reality sank in. Anger, shock, a kind of disbelief that the world had turned against him. But the world hadn't turned against him. I had simply stepped out of it. And Paul, his biological father, the man they glorified in whispers, was nowhere to be seen. He had promised to make it special, but like always, his promises were smoke. Evan stood there, humiliated, and I said nothing, because the lesson was already written in the empty spaces. This is what life looks like without me. I had made my choice, and for the first time in 15 years, I felt the weight begin to lift. The silence after my decision didn't last long. Silence never does in a house built on demands. Within days, the ripples of my withdrawal became waves, and soon those waves crashed over every corner of their lives. The first was the internet. It cut off on a Thursday afternoon, right in the middle of Chris's gaming session. He stormed into the living room, his face red, his voice cracking as he yelled, "What the hell, Dan? Why isn't the Wi-Fi working?" I looked up from my chair, where I was reading the paper, and said simply, "Because I didn't pay for it." "You can't just do that," he shouted, like a judge delivering a verdict. "We need it." "No," I said calmly. "You want it. There's a difference. And if I'm nobody here, then nobody has to provide it." His jaw worked like he wanted to say more, but nothing came out. He slammed his bedroom door so hard the frame rattled. The next came with the phones. By Monday, both boys were pacing the kitchen, waving their dead phones like broken *p***ness. "Service is out," Evan muttered, glaring at me as if I had personally strangled the satellites in the sky. "I missed 3 calls from my girlfriend." "That's terrible," I said, pouring myself coffee. "Maybe your father can add you to his plan." Margaret sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a mug, her silence heavy. She didn't defend me, but she didn't defend them either. She just looked down, as if the grain of the wood might offer an answer she couldn't find in herself. By the end of the week, the insurance notices arrived. Chris's car sat in the driveway, uninsured, while Evan called me from a borrowed phone at school, furious that the bursar's office had slapped a hold on his account. His voice shook with anger. "They're saying tuition isn't paid. I can't even register for classes. You've ruined everything." "No," I said. "I just stopped saving you from yourselves. You wanted me to be nobody, so I am." He hung up on me. The household cracked apart. Meals turned to battlegrounds. Chris accused me of betrayal at every turn, shouting that I was petty, that I was acting like a child. Evan called me vindictive, bitter, and small-minded. Margaret begged me to reconsider, her voice trembling, her eyes red from tears. She whispered at night when the boys couldn't hear, pleading, "Don't do this, Dan. Don't punish them like this." But I wasn't punishing them. I was simply removing myself from a role they never wanted me to play. Then came the night of Evan's prom, the event that revealed the true cost of their contempt. He had been planning it for months, talking endlessly about the tuxedo, the limousine, the photographer who would capture every smile, every laugh. He wanted the kind of night that lived forever in pictures, the kind of night kids bragged about years later. Margaret had promised him that it would be perfect, and he believed her because in the past I had always made it perfect. But not this time. Without my money, the fantasy unraveled. The limo was never booked. The tuxedo rental was canceled. The professional photographer never appeared. His girlfriend's dress had been borrowed from a cousin, and it showed. The fit was slightly wrong, the seams tired. Evan himself wore an old suit from 2 years ago, the cuffs too short, the shoulders too tight. I stood in the living room as he buttoned the jacket, his face pale, his jaw clenched. Margaret fluttered around him, trying to fix what couldn't be fixed, smoothing the lapels, brushing lint away, forcing a smile she didn't feel. Chris leaned against the wall, smirking at his brother's discomfort, though his eyes betrayed fear that his own turn would come soon enough. Evan's girlfriend arrived in her borrowed dress, her eyes flickering with disappointment before she masked it with a brittle smile. They left together in his beat-up car. Not a limo, not a gleaming chariot, but a rusted sedan with one headlight dimmer than the other. And when they arrived at the school gymnasium, lit with cheap string lights and decorated with paper banners, Evan's humiliation bloomed in full. His classmates stepped out of limos, their dates in gowns that shimmered under the weak lights. Cameras flashed, tuxedos gleamed, laughter echoed, and Evan, in his too small suit, with no photographer to immortalize the night, walked through the doors like a shadow among candles. His friends noticed. Of course they did. Teenagers always notice. Some smirked, some whispered, some turned away in silence that cut deeper than words. He tried to hold his head high, but humiliation clung to him like a second skin. Meanwhile, Paul, the biological father they worshipped in their defiance of me, was nowhere to be seen. He had promised to make it special, but like every promise before, it dissolved into thin air. A phone call, an excuse, and then nothing. Evan's eyes scanned the crowd for him, but he never appeared. Later that night, when Evan came home, he didn't speak. He walked past me without a word, his shoulders slumped, his face blank. Margaret followed him with tears in her eyes, whispering apologies, though not to me. Never to me. She cried because her son's dream had collapsed, not because of the years I carried them before I finally set the weight down. Chris tried to mock me, tried to call me cruel for letting it happen. But the laughter in his voice was hollow. He saw the truth, even if he wouldn't admit it. Without me, their world crumbled. I sat on the porch that night, a glass of whiskey in my hand, listening to the quiet of the Tennessee night. The cicadas hummed, the stars burned cold above, and in the distance I heard the muffled sobs of a boy who had learned, at last, what life without me looked like. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't cruelty. It was truth. For years I had been the invisible hand that held everything together. And when I let go, everything fell apart. The night of the prom passed, but the fallout lingered like smoke after a fire. The house grew tense, filled with slammed doors, whispered arguments, and eyes that refused to meet mine. Evan barely spoke for days, his humiliation still raw. Chris avoided me except to mutter curses under his breath. Margaret wept in silence, clutching laundry or dishes as if scrubbing hard enough might erase the fractures. But fractures don't disappear. They widen, and soon they became chasms. Margaret confronted me first. It was late, the boys upstairs, the house heavy with their sulking silence. She stood in the kitchen, her hands gripping the counter so tightly her knuckles whitened. "You've torn this family apart, Dan," she said, her voice low, her eyes blazing with something between rage and despair. "Do you even see what you've done?" I looked at her, calm, almost tired. "No, Margaret. The family tore itself apart the night your sons told me I was nobody. I didn't destroy anything. I just stepped aside so you could all live in the world you created." Her lips trembled, her eyes shining with tears. "They're just boys. They don't understand the weight of their words. You're the adult. You're supposed to be stronger than this." I set down my glass of whiskey and leaned forward. My voice was sharp, deliberate, every word a knife. Stronger? I was strong for 15 years. I carried them, carried you, carried this house. I paid every bill, signed every check, patched every hole. And what did I get in return? Silence. Contempt. You want me to be stronger? No, Margaret. I've been strong enough. What I won't be is a fool any longer. She flinched, but said nothing. The storm came fully a week later, when Evan finally erupted. He came home from school furious, the weight of his future pressing down like a stone. He threw his backpack across the room, the sound echoing like a G***T. "You ruined my life," he screamed. "Do you understand that? Without you, I can't pay for classes. I can't graduate. I can't do anything. You're destroying everything I worked for." I stared at him, unflinching. "Everything you worked for? Tell me, Evan, who paid for every class until now? Who signed every check? Who wrote every tuition payment? Who gave you the life you have? It wasn't Paul. It wasn't your mother. It was me. And you spat in my face. You told me I was nothing. So now you get to live in that truth." His eyes filled with tears, though anger still held his voice sharp. "You're petty. You're just bitter because we don't call you Dad." I leaned forward, my tone cold. "I don't need to be called Dad. I don't need to be loved. But I will not be used. You made it clear what I was to you. Now I'm simply acting accordingly." Chris chimed in then, his voice mocking. "You're pathetic. You think this makes you strong? You're just proving us right. You were never our father, and you never will be." I turned my gaze on him, steady as stone. "Then don't come crying when your car sits uninsured, when your gas tank is empty, when your phone doesn't work. You wanted me to be nobody? Then I'll be nobody." The room went silent, the only sound the hum of the refrigerator and the shallow breaths of 3 people who suddenly realized they had no safety net left. That night, Margaret tried again. She sat beside me on the porch, the summer air heavy, her eyes swollen from crying. "Dan, please, she whispered. Don't do this. Don't walk away from everything we built. The boys, they'll see eventually. They'll understand one day. I sipped my whiskey, watching the dark line of trees against the horizon. I gave them 15 years to see, 15 years to understand. They never did, and you never made them. That silence of yours, that silence was agreement. You let them believe I was nothing. Now I believe it too. Her tears fell, but I felt no urge to comfort her. The well inside me had run dry. The following days brought the inevitable collapse. Chris's car was repossessed after an accident with no insurance. Evan's bursar office sent final warnings. No payment, no classes. Margaret scrambled, calling Paul, begging him to step up. He offered excuses, as he always had. Too broke, too busy, too far away. The man they glorified in whispers could barely manage his own life, let alone theirs. And in those moments, the truth became undeniable. I had been the pillar all along. The man they dismissed, the man they mocked, was the one holding the roof above their heads. And now, with my hands withdrawn, the roof was collapsing. Margaret tried one last desperate plea. She found me in the living room one evening, the house dim, the boys upstairs in their misery. She knelt beside me, clutching my hand, her voice raw. Don't leave us like this, she begged. Don't leave them. Don't leave me. Please, Dan. We need you. I looked down at her, my jaw tight. No, Margaret. You need the man you silenced. The man you allowed your sons to humiliate. You need the nobody you created. But I won't be that anymore. Her face crumpled, her sobs breaking the stillness of the room. But I didn't bend. The next morning I packed a bag. I didn't slam doors, didn't shout, didn't demand apologies. I simply gathered my things, set my keys on the counter, and walked out the door. The boys watched from the stairs, their faces pale, their mouths half open as if they wanted to speak but couldn't. Margaret stood in the kitchen doorway, her tears silent now, her hands trembling at her sides. I paused at the threshold, looked back once and said, "Respect can't be bought. You told me I was nothing. Now you get to live without me." Then I walked out. The days that followed were quiet in a way I had never known. I rented a small place by the river, nothing fancy, just four walls and peace. No slammed doors, no demands, no contempt echoing through the rooms. I sat on the porch at night with a glass of whiskey, the cicadas singing in the darkness, and for the first time in years, I felt free. Margaret called once. She begged. She wept. She promised the boys would change. I listened, then ended the call. Evan wrote me a message weeks later, filled with excuses and half apologies, blaming stress, blaming youth. I never answered, because I finally understood the truth. Love without respect is slavery. And I had been a slave long enough. Now I live in silence, in peace, though the ghosts of those years still haunt me. Sometimes I wonder if I was cruel, if I should have stayed, if I should have forgiven. But then I remember their voices, sharp and cold across the dinner table. You're not our dad. You're nobody. And I remind myself, I only became what they told me I was. So I ask you, was I wrong to walk away? Or was it the only way to save myself from a family that never truly wanted me?
Bye-bye.